The Duke of Ashworth was a ghost, at every London ball a phantom of heartache, bound by a vow he swore over a lover's grave he would never love again. Society whispered his name, Alistair Blackwood, painting him as a monster, whose cold heart had shattered the most delicate of flowers. They called him the Duke of Ashes, ruling over a dead dynasty. For 5 years he believed them. He let the bitterness consume him. Until one night, hidden in the shadows of a crowded ballroom, he heard a voice, not a whisper, but a clear, defiant defense of his tarnished name. And the ghost of Ashworth began to feel the stirrings of life once more. The London season of 1823 was a glittering, ravenous beast, and Alistair Blackwood, the 9th Duke of Ashworth, was its favourite cautionary tale. At 32, he possessed a severe, almost punishing beauty. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that seemed carved from granite, and eyes the colour of a stormy sea. He also possessed a fortune that could buy half of Mayfair, and a title that dripped with centuries of power. Yet he moved through the opulent ballrooms and manicured parks of the Ton with the detached air of a man attending his own protracted funeral. They called him the Duke of Ashes. It was a cruel but fitting moniker. 5 years prior, his world had been incinerated. His betrothed, the beautiful and vivacious Lady Isabella Beaufort, had died in a tragic riding accident on his estate. The official story was a spooked horse and a fatal fall. But society, in its insatiable hunger for scandal, had penned its own more sinister version. They whispered that the Duke's coldness, his possessive nature, had driven her to recklessness. They said he had broken her spirit long before the fall broke her neck. Alistair did nothing to dispel the rumours. In truth, he welcomed them. They were a shield and armour of infamy that kept the simpering debutantes and their matchmaking mummers at bay. He had sworn an oath over Isabella's casket, a bitter promise whispered into the cold earth he would never again allow a woman to breach the walls of his heart. Love was a fool's game, a currency of betrayal and pain, and he was done playing. His life became a rigid routine of managing his vast estates, attending Parliament, and making the briefest, most begrudging appearances at social functions required by his station. He would stand near the French doors, a glass of brandy in his hand, his expression a mask of indifference, watching the swirling colours of the ballroom as if observing a particularly vapid species of insect. On the other side of this glittering world was Miss Eleanora Vance. Eleanora was not a diamond of the first water. She was not breathtakingly beautiful, like the season's incomparable Lady Seraphina Cavendish. Her beauty was quieter found in the intelligence of her warm chestnut eyes, the gentle curve of her smile, and the determined set of her chin. She was in London for one reason: to secure a respectable match. Her father, a country baron with more lineage than coin, had suffered a series of poor investments. The Vance family's future rested on Eleanora marrying well. She hated it. She loathed the superficiality, the transactional nature of it all. She preferred reading philosophy in her father's dusty library to mastering the art of the flirtatious fan. But she loved her family, especially her 2 younger sisters, whose futures depended on her success. So she smiled, she curtsied, and she endured the insipid prattle of young lords whose ambitions extended no further than the cut of their waistcoat. Eleanora had, of course, heard the stories of the Duke of Ashworth. She had seen him from afar, a dark, imposing figure who seemed to suck the very light and warmth from his surroundings. The other ladies swooned over his tragic allure or shivered in delicious fear of his reputation. Eleanora felt neither. She felt a flicker of pity for a man so clearly haunted, but mostly she was repulsed by the glee with which society picked at his wounds. Gossip was a sport she refused to play. She believed in evidence in character, in the truth that lay beneath the polished surface. Their paths had never crossed, not truly. A curt nod in the park, a shared moment of silence in a crowded room, before he turned and departed. He was a planet of ice in a distant orbit, and she was a minor star struggling to keep her own light from extinguishing. She had no reason to think of him, and he, she was certain, had never even registered her existence. The universe, however, had other plans, and the setting for its grand design was to be the most anticipated event of the season, Lady Atherton's annual masquerade ball. Lady Atherton's ballroom was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. Hundreds of guests, hidden behind masks of velvet silk and feathers, moved under the shimmering light of a dozen crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and beeswax, and the music of the string quartet was a lively counterpoint to the incessant hum of gossip. Alistair despised masquerades more than any other social ritual. The pretense of anonymity only seemed to sharpen the malice of the rumour mill. Tonight he had intended to make his appearance, nod to his hostess, and retreat within the quarter hour. But the suffocating heat and the press of bodies had driven him to seek refuge. He found it in a small shadowed alcove behind a large potted palm, partially concealed by a heavy damask curtain. From here he could observe, without being observed, a ghost in his own right, nursing a glass of scotch, and his customary disdain. He was about to drain his glass and depart, when he caught snippets of a conversation from a group of dandies and debutantes gathered just beyond the curtain. Their voices were low, but their words were sharp as glass. "Look, there is Lady Seraphina," said Lord Harrington, a man whose chin was as weak as his character. "They say she has her sights set on the Duke of Ashes himself. A brave woman to attempt to thaw that glacier." A nervous titter went through the group. "Thaw him," scoffed another young Lord Percy Finch. "More like get herself impaled on one of his icicles. My father says the man's heart is a stone. He drove poor Isabella Beaufort to her grave with his coldness." "I heard it was more than coldness," a young lady whispered, conspiratorially, her peacock feather mask trembling with excitement. "I heard he has a terrible temper, that he flew into a jealous rage, and she fled from him on that horse, terrified for her life." Alistair's hand tightened on his glass, the crystal groaning in protest. It was the same vile, baseless narrative. He had heard it 100 times, 1,000. Each word was a fresh turn of the knife in a wound that refused to heal. He should leave. He should walk away and let them have their petty fictions. But he was frozen, trapped by the morbid fascination of hearing his own eulogy recited by fools. It was then that a new voice joined the conversation, clear and steady, cutting through the malicious whispers like a beam of sunlight through smoke. "And what evidence have you for such a terrible accusation?" Alistair stilled. He did not recognize the voice, but its tone was unlike any he was used to hearing. It wasn't coy or flirtatious. It was direct, laced with an unnerving sincerity. Lord Harrington sputtered, taken aback. "Evidence one needs only to look at him. He is the very picture of misery. A man in love does not become a recluse when his beloved dies. A man consumed by guilt, however. A man consumed by grief might," the voice replied calmly. Eleanor Vance, her simple silver mask failing to conceal the earnest fire in her eyes, stepped forward slightly. She could not see the Duke hidden mere feet away. She saw only the smug, self-satisfied faces of the gossips. Is it not possible that his coldness is a shell built to protect a heart that has been shattered? Is it not the height of cruelty to speculate on the nature of a private tragedy, to weave tales for our own amusement from another's profound pain? Percy Finch scoffed. "You are a romantic, Miss Vance. The Tun is not a storybook. The Duke is a powerful, wealthy man. Men like that are not shattered. They are possessive. Isabella Beaufort was a songbird, and he locked her in a cage. You did not know him, Eleonora insisted, her voice gaining strength. Nor did you know her beyond a few pleasantries in a drawing room. You trade in caricatures, not character. To condemn a man based on hearsay is a failure of logic, and more importantly, a failure of compassion. I do not know the Duke of Ashworth, but I know that he lost the woman he was to marry. That alone should grant him a measure of grace, not the venom of your baseless conjecture. The group fell into a stunned, uncomfortable silence. To be so openly rebuked, and by a young, unmarried woman of little consequence, was a social shockwave. Lord Harrington, his face flushed with anger, sneered. Perhaps you have aspirations in that direction, yourself, Miss Vance. Defending the monster, in hopes he might notice you. Eleonora's chin lifted. I defend the principle of truth, my lord, a concept with which you seem entirely unfamiliar. Now, if you'll excuse me, the air here has grown rather stale. With a final unwavering look, she turned and disappeared back into the crowd. Behind the curtain, Alistair stood, as if turned to stone. His knuckles were white where he gripped his glass. For 5 years, no one had ever defended him. They had feared him, flattered him, desired his title, but not one person had ever stood in the face of public opinion and spoken up for the man, for his grief, for the simple human decency of privacy. He had expected her to be a simpering idealist or a clever social climber. But her words had the unadorned ring of truth. She hadn't defended him to gain his favor. She had no idea he was there. She had defended him because her own moral compass demanded it. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his glass. The ice around his heart, an impenetrable fortress for half a decade, felt the faintest, most terrifying tremor. A crack had appeared in the permafrost, and through it for the first time in a very long time, a flicker of warmth curiosity was beginning to seep through. He had to know the name that belonged to that voice. He had to know the woman who saw not a monster, but a man. The morning after Lady Atherton's ball, the name Miss Eleonora Vance was procured with astonishing ease. Alistair's man of affairs, Mr. Thompson, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient individual, had a full report on his desk by 10 o'clock. Baron Vance, of declining fortunes. 3 daughters. In town to find a husband for the eldest Eleonora. Residing in a modest but respectable rented house on a less fashionable square. Ordinarily, this information would have been dismissed. A desperate debutante from a falling house was the last thing on earth he wanted. But her defense of him had been anything but desperate. It had been principled. It had been brave. Alistair did not send flowers. He did not leave his card. Such conventional overtures felt inadequate, false. Instead, he did something that sent a ripple of confusion through the ton. He attended a lecture at the Royal Society on advancements in steam power, a subject he knew Miss Vance, according to Thompson's report, had a keen interest in. Eleonora was there with her bookish father. She was so engrossed in the speaker's presentation that she didn't notice him until the lecture concluded and the attendees began to mingle. She turned from a conversation with her father and found the Duke of Ashworth standing before her. He was even more imposing up close. The air around him seemed to crackle with a cold, intense energy. For a moment she was speechless, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Had someone told him of her words at the ball? Was he here to thank her, or worse, to rebuke her for her audacity? "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smoother than she'd imagined, but devoid of warmth. "Your father." He gave a curt nod to the Baron. "Your Grace." Her father stammered, clearly overwhelmed. I found the discourse on kinetic energy transfer surprisingly coherent. Alistair stated, his gaze fixed on Eleonora. It was a test. Eleonora found her voice. Indeed, Your Grace. Though I felt Professor Davies might have given more credit to the work of Nicholas Carnot on thermodynamics. His theories lay the very foundation for what we heard today. A flicker of something surprise respect passed through Alistair's stormy eyes. He had expected a polite, vapid agreement. He had not expected a well-reasoned critique. You have read Carnot in the original French, she confirmed simply. His prose is as elegant as his reasoning. An unfamiliar sensation tugged at the corner of Alistair's mouth. It was the ghost of a smile. I have a first edition in my library. Perhaps you would care to see it sometime. The offer hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. It was not an invitation to a dance or a stroll in the park. It was an invitation into his world, the private intellectual sanctum he guarded so fiercely. Before Eleonora could formulate a reply, her father, seeing a golden opportunity, eagerly accepted on her behalf. Their courtship, as the scandalized Tun immediately labeled it, proceeded along these unconventional lines. He did not court her with poetry or flatteries. He challenged her. He sent her a copy of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, with a note asking for her opinion on his theories of labor. She returned it with a meticulously argued letter, disagreeing with him on several key points. He took her not for a carriage ride in Hyde Park's fashionable Serpent Drive, but to a grimy, deafeningly loud workshop to see a working prototype of a new steam engine. During these encounters, Eleonora saw glimpses of the man behind the fearsome ducal mask. She saw a brilliant, incisive mind, a deep-seated frustration with the frivolous society he was forced to inhabit, and a profound, bone-deep loneliness that resonated with her own feelings of being an outsider. He was still guarded. His words clipped the walls around him miles high. But occasionally, when she made a particularly sharp point or an unexpectedly witty remark, she would see that flicker in his eyes again, that hint of warmth, and it was more intoxicating than any pretty compliment. Society was baffled. The Duke of Ashes, who had shown no interest in any woman for 5 years, was spending his time with a penniless, opinionated blue stocking. Lady Seraphina Cavendish watched their interactions with a venomous glare, her perfect porcelain features twisted in contempt. Lord Harrington and his cronies whispered that the Duke was merely amusing himself, that he would crush the poor girl when he grew bored. One afternoon, as Alistair and Eleonora were walking through the British Museum discussing the Elgin marbles, they were approached by a man whose charming smile did not quite reach his eyes. He was handsome, dressed in the height of fashion, and carried himself with an easy, aristocratic grace. Alistair, my dear cousin, I had not heard you'd developed a taste for antiquities, the man said, his voice smooth as silk. Alistair's posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly. The warmth that had begun to creep into his expression vanished, replaced by a glacial coldness. Julian, what are you doing in London? Can a man not visit his own family? Julian Croft replied, his gaze sliding to Eleonora, appraising her with an unnerving intensity. And you have not introduced me to your lovely companion. Miss Eleonora Vance, may I present my cousin, Mr. Julian Croft Alistair, said, his tone flat and formal. Miss Vance, Julian said, taking her hand and bowing over it with a theatrical flourish. It is an absolute enchantment. My cousin is a fortunate man to have captured your attention. He is a man of deep and complex sorrows. The words were spoken with a tone of sympathy, but Eleonora felt a chill. There was an undercurrent to them, a suggestion of a shared secret knowledge that excluded her. Alistair's jaw tightened. We were just leaving, Alistair stated his hand, moving to Eleonora's elbow in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. He steered her away, leaving his cousin standing there with that same unsettling smile. As they walked out into the pale sunlight, the easy companionship they had been building felt fractured. The shadows had returned to Alistair's eyes, deeper and more turbulent than ever before. The appearance of his cousin had unearthed a ghost from a past Eleonora knew nothing about, and for the first time she felt a genuine tremor of fear. The Duke of Ashworth was not just a man of grief, he was a man with secrets, and she was beginning to realize that those secrets might be far darker than any society gossip could have possibly imagined. The arrival of Julian Croft acted like a change in atmospheric pressure heralding a storm. The fragile ease that had been growing between Alistair and Eleonora was replaced by a palpable tension. Alistair became more withdrawn, the silences between them stretching longer, freighted with things unsaid. Eleonora could feel him wrestling with his demons, but the walls he had momentarily lowered were now being rebuilt, brick by painful brick. Julian, meanwhile, integrated himself seamlessly into the London season. He was everything Alistair was not: charming, affable, and a master of social graces. He made a point of seeking Eleonora out at soirees and balls, always with a disarming smile and a kind word. "I do hope you will not judge my side of the family by Alistair's melancholic disposition," he told her one evening in the garden of a Vauxhall gala, his voice a confidential murmur. The loss of Lady Isabella changed him irrevocably. He was not always so grim. "Grief changes everyone," Eleonora replied, wary of his intentions. But this was more than grief. Julian sighed, shaking his head with practiced sadness. "It was guilt. You see, dear Miss Vance, my cousin is a man of intense passions. He loved Isabella fiercely. Too fiercely, perhaps. He saw slights where there were none, rivals in every gentleman who so much as smiled at her." Eleonora felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "I do not believe it is my place to discuss the Duke's private affairs." "Of course not," Julian agreed smoothly. "It is just, I see the way he looks at you, and I worry. He is building you a pedestal, just as he did for her. And the fall from one of Alistair's pedestals can be a great and terrible thing. Isabella was so full of life, a free spirit. She felt suffocated. That final ride. She was not merely exercising her horse, Miss Vance. She was fleeing an argument, fleeing him. Julian's words were a poison, seeping into the cracks of doubt that Alistair's own reticence had created. Eleonora wanted to dismiss them as the jealous ramblings of a lesser cousin, but they echoed the very whispers she had once so vehemently decried. Could there be a kernel of truth to the rumours? Was Alistair's pain not just grief, but the guilt of a man who had pushed the woman he loved to her death? Her unease festered. She tried to broach the subject with Alistair to give him a chance to confide in her. One afternoon, in his vast, silent library, she gathered her courage. "Your Grace," she began, her voice softer than she intended. "Alistair, people speak of Lady Isabella. Your cousin has mentioned her. I wish you would tell me about her, about what happened." Alistair, who had been showing her a rare illuminated manuscript, went rigid. The book snapped shut with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. He turned to face her, his eyes no longer stormy but frozen lakes of ice. "There is nothing to tell," he said, his voice clipped and final. "The past is dead. Let it remain buried." How can it be she pressed a desperate need for the truth, overriding her caution? "It is not buried, it is haunting you. It stands between us now. If you cannot trust me with your pain, how can there be anything more?" "Trust," he scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "I trusted once. I gave my heart, my name, my future, and in return, I was handed ashes. I will not make that mistake again. You defended my name in a ballroom, Miss Vance, and for that you have my gratitude. But do not presume to understand the contents of my heart or the ghosts that reside there." Each word was a slap. He was pushing her away deliberately and cruelly, using the very pain she was trying to understand as a weapon against her. All her fears, all the doubts Julian had planted, seemed to coalesce into a terrible, sickening certainty. He was guilty. He was hiding something, not from grief but from shame. Tears pricked her eyes, tears of frustration and hurt. I see she whispered, her voice trembling. The gossips were right after all. I was a fool to think otherwise. She did not wait for a response. She turned and fled the library, fled the grand oppressive townhouse, and fled the man she was beginning against all odds to love. Alistair watched her go, his posture, ramrod straight his face, an unreadable mask of stone. But inside his carefully constructed world was shattering. By pushing her away to protect his secret, he had confirmed her worst fears, and in the process had just lost the one person who had ever made him feel he could be whole again. He was alone once more, the undisputed king of his cold, silent kingdom of ashes. The days that followed were a torment for Eleonora. She threw herself into a frantic social schedule, accepting every invitation, dancing with every witless lord, and laughing at every vapid joke, all in a desperate attempt to fill the void Alistair had left. Society, seeing her sudden separation from the Duke, concluded their little spectacle was over. Lady Seraphina was triumphant, Lord Harrington smug. Eleonora was just another moth who had flown too close to Ashworth's cold flame and been burned. But in the quiet hours of the night, her mind refused to rest. Alistair's harsh words echoed in her ears, but so did the memory of the vulnerability she had glimpsed in his eyes. The two images warred within her. Her heart, which had felt the pull of his lonely soul, could not reconcile with the image of a jealous tyrant. There was a piece missing from the puzzle, an inconsistency she couldn't ignore. Julian Croft's story was too neat, too perfectly aligned with the public narrative. He presented himself as the concerned cousin, yet there was a flicker of triumph in his eyes whenever he spoke of Alistair's misery. It was the same look she'd seen on Lord Harrington's face, the look of a scavenger feeding on another's ruin. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, Eleonora decided she had to know the truth. Not for the Duke who had cast her aside, but for herself. For the memory of the woman whose good name had been sacrificed in the Ton's vicious games. She began her quiet investigation. Her first step was to learn more about Lady Isabella Beaufort. She discovered that Isabella's former lady's maid, a woman named Martha Thorne, had been dismissed from service shortly after her mistress's death, and now lived in a small cottage in the countryside, paid a modest pension by the Beaufort family to ensure her silence. It took Eleonora nearly all of her pin money to hire a carriage, telling her family she was visiting a sick friend. She found Martha Thorne, a woman whose face was etched with a sorrow that time had not softened, tending a small garden. At first, Martha was reluctant to speak her loyalty to her late mistress, still fierce. "They all tell lies," Martha said, her hands trembling as she snipped a dead rose. The lords and ladies in London. They never knew her. They never knew him. "Then tell me," Eleonora pleaded, her voice gentle. "Tell me what you know. I do not believe the Duke is the monster they claim." Seeing the genuine compassion in Eleonora's eyes, Martha's resolve crumbled. "A monster. Your Grace, no miss. He was demanding. He expected honesty, loyalty, and Lady Isabella. She was young and flighty, and she feared his intensity. He loved her. Oh yes, like the sun loves the earth. but it was a powerful, all-consuming love, and it frightened her. The old woman led Eleonora inside her small, tidy cottage. From a locked wooden chest she retrieved a small leather-bound diary. She was not happy, miss, but it wasn't the Duke who was the cause of her unhappiness. It was another. Martha explained that in the months leading up to her death, Isabella had been receiving secret visits from Julian Croft. He had charmed her, flattered her, and preyed on her fears of marrying the powerful, serious Duke. He'd convinced her it was an infatuation, a last girlish fancy before she settled down. But it was more than that. Martha whispered, her eyes dark with memory. He was poisoning her mind against the Duke, twisting his every word, his every action, making his devotion seem like possession. Then came the final, devastating revelation. The day she died, Martha said, her voice barely audible. She and the Duke had argued. He had found a note from Mr. Croft and confronted her. He did not yell, miss. That was not his way. His voice went quiet and cold. He asked for the truth. He felt betrayed. She panicked. She ran from the library and ordered her horse, a spirited stallion he had told her not to ride alone. She was a fine horsewoman, but she was distraught, not paying attention. Martha's words painted a new picture. Not of a tyrant driving his love to her death, but of a man betrayed and hurting, confronting a terrible truth, only to have it result in an even more terrible tragedy. His guilt wasn't over cruelty, but over the fact that their final moments together had been spent in anger and mistrust. His vow of silence wasn't a punishment for her, but for himself. "There is more," Martha said, her hand shaking, as she passed a folded yellowed piece of parchment to Eleonora. "I found this in her jewelry box after. I never showed it to the Duke. He was so broken, I couldn't bear to cause him more pain. It's a letter. From her. To Mr. Croft." Eleonora unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. The elegant looping script was blurred in places, as if by tears. It was a letter breaking off their affair. "Julian," it read, "you must not visit me again. What we have done is a terrible mistake, a betrayal of a good man who has offered me nothing but his whole heart. His love may be a formidable thing, but it is true, while your words are but charming lies. I have wronged him deeply, and I must confess everything and beg his forgiveness. I pray it is not too late. Do not seek me out. I will not see you. Isabella." The date on the letter was the morning of her death. Eleonora's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The proof. Isabella hadn't been fleeing Alistair's rage. She had been consumed by her own guilt, planning to end her affair with Julian and confess everything. Julian had lied. He had not only orchestrated the affair that led to her death, but he had twisted the narrative framing Alistair for the tragedy while erasing his own culpability. He had allowed his cousin to suffer for 5 years under a cloud of lies that he himself had created. The cold knot of dread in Eleonora's stomach transformed into a hot, blazing fire of indignation. She now held the truth in her hands. The question was, what was she going to do with it? Armed with Isabella's letter, Eleonora returned to London, her mind racing. She could not simply present the letter to Alistair. His pride was a fortress. He had pushed her away so violently that a direct approach might only make him retreat further. And Julian was cunning. He would deny everything, paint the letter as a forgery, and her as a hysterical, meddling woman. No, the truth needed a bigger stage. It needed to be brought into the light in a way that would leave no room for shadows or lies, and Julian, in his arrogance, was about to provide the perfect venue. He had been courting Lady Seraphina Cavendish with a theatrical ardour, and to celebrate their unofficial betrothal, her father was hosting a lavish ball. It was to be the event of the season, a public crowning of the new power couple. Eleanora knew both Julian and Alistair would be there. When the night of the ball arrived, Eleanora dressed with deliberate care. She chose a simple gown of deep crimson, a colour of courage and conviction. She wore no jewellery save for a simple locket. With Isabella's letter tucked safely in her reticule, she entered the Cavendish ballroom, a soldier marching into battle. She found Alistair first. He was in his usual spot near the terrace doors, a dark, solitary pillar of misery amidst the gaiety. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her, a flicker of pain and longing quickly masked by his icy reserve. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm surprised to see you. There is something you need to witness." "Your Grace," she said, her own voice steady, betraying none of the frantic beating of her heart. "I ask only that you remain here and listen." Before he could question her, she turned and walked directly towards the centre of the ballroom, where Julian Croft was holding court, regaling a rapt audience, including Lady Seraphina, with a witty anecdote. Mr. Croft Eleanora's voice rang out clear and sharp, silencing the chatter around them. The orchestra faltered, then fell silent. Every eye in the room turned to them. Julian's smile tightened. "Miss Vance? To what do we owe this dramatic interruption? I have come to correct a story you have been telling for a very long time," Eleanora said, her gaze unwavering. "The story of Lady Isabella Beaufort's death." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Lady Seraphina looked horrified. Julian's face paled, but he quickly recovered, letting out a condescending laugh. "My dear girl, you are overwrought. Grief is a difficult thing, but it is no excuse for public hysterics." "This is not hysterics, sir. It is an indictment." Eleanora retorted, her voice rising with righteous fury. "You have dined out on the tragedy of your cousin for 5 years. You painted him as a monster to soothe your own guilty conscience. You told me, and countless others, that Lady Isabella was fleeing his cruelty on the day she died. You lied." From across the room, Alistair took an involuntary step forward, his eyes locked on Eleanora, his mind reeling. "These are dangerous accusations," Julian hissed, his charm dissolving to reveal the venom beneath. "You have no proof." "Don't I?" Eleanora's hand went to her reticule. "I have the testimony of Isabella's lady's maid, who witnessed your secret courtship, your manipulation. And I have this." She pulled out the letter. The room was so quiet, the crinkle of the parchment sounded like thunder. She held it up for all to see. A letter, she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "Written by Lady Isabella to you on the very morning of her death. A letter in which she ends your affair, calls your words charming lies, and states her intention to confess everything to the Duke and beg his forgiveness. She wasn't fleeing him, Mr. Croft. She was trying to return to him." Julian stared at the letter as if it were a serpent. All the blood had drained from his face. He was trapped, exposed before the entire ton. "This is a forgery," he choked out. "A desperate ploy by a ruined woman to win back the Duke's favour, but the damage was done." The crowd was murmuring their faces, a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. They looked from Julian's panicked expression to the Duke of Ashworth, who was now striding across the floor, his face a thunderous mask of revelation. Alistair stopped before Eleanora, his gaze not on his cousin, but on her. He saw the courage it had taken, the risk she had undertaken, all for his name, for a truth she had no reason to believe in, but did anyway. He turned to Julian, and for the first time in 5 years, the ice in his voice melted, replaced by a white, hot fire. You let me live in that hell, he said, his voice dangerously low. You let me carry the weight of her death, the guilt of that final argument, while you built your life upon my ruin. Julian, cornered and desperate, made a fatal error. He lunged not at Alistair, but at Eleonora, trying to snatch the letter from her hand. Alistair moved with a speed that was shocking, intercepting him, his hand clamping around Julian's wrist like a manacle of steel. You will not touch her, Alistair snarled. You will leave this city tonight. If I ever see your face again, if I ever hear your name spoken in my presence, I will finish what we should have finished 5 years ago. Do you understand me? Defeated and utterly disgraced, Julian could only nod, his body trembling. Alistair released him with a shove. Julian stumbled backward, met on all sides by the cold, accusatory stares of the society that had once adored him. Without another word, he turned and fled the ballroom, his social life and his future in tatters. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of whispers. But Alistair heard none of it. He turned back to Eleonora, who stood brave and trembling in the eye of the storm she had created. He saw not a meddling bluestocking, but a lioness. His lioness. He took the letter from her hand, his fingers gently brushing hers. Then, without a word, he took her arm and led her from the ballroom, away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues, out onto the cool, quiet terrace under the forgiving light of the moon. The duel was over. The truth had won. And a new, terrifying, wonderful dawn was breaking. The silence on the terrace was a world unto itself. It was profound and absolute, broken only by the whisper of a cool night breeze rustling the ivy that clung to the stone balustrade, and the distant, ghost-like strains of a waltz from the ballroom they had just abandoned. The chaotic scene, inside the shocked faces, the frantic whispers, the utter humiliation of Julian Croft felt 1,000 miles away. Here, under the serene silver gaze of the moon, there were only 2 people suspended in the fragile moment after a battle had been won. Alistair stood without moving, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the glittering London skyline. He still held Isabella's letter, the brittle parchment, a tangible link to a past that had just been violently rewritten. His knuckles were white where he gripped it, the only outward sign of the tectonic shift occurring within him. For 5 years his identity had been fused with his grief and guilt. He was the Duke of Ashes, a man defined by tragedy. Now the foundations of that identity had been pulverized, and he felt adrift. He turned his head slowly, his stormy eyes falling upon Eleonora. She stood straight and proud, the crimson of her gown a defiant splash of color in the monochrome night. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving a tremor in its wake. She had wagered everything, her reputation, her future, on a truth she had pieced together from a grieving maid and a forgotten letter. Seeing him now, seeing the raw, unguarded bewilderment on his face, she felt a wave of uncertainty. Had she done the right thing? Had she freed him? Or had she simply ripped open old wounds for all the world to see? He finally broke the silence, his voice raspy, as if scraped over years of disuse. Why, the single word was not an accusation, but a plea for understanding. It was freighted with the weight of 5 years of solitude, of 1,000 nights spent staring into a fireplace haunted by ghosts. I was cruel to you. In my library, I used my pain as a cudgel to drive you away. I let you believe the worst of me. Why would you fight for a man who had already surrendered? Eleonora took a tentative step closer, the silk of her dress whispering against the flagstones. Because I never truly believed it, she answered, her voice soft but unwavering. Not in my heart. The world saw a monster, a cold, unfeeling duke. But I saw a man who discussed thermodynamics with passion and who valued an honest opinion over a pretty compliment. I saw a man so terrified of being hurt again that he chose to encase himself in ice rather than risk the warmth. That man was not a monster. And that man, she finished her gaze, locking with his, deserved the truth, even if he was unwilling to seek it for himself. His breath shuddered out of him. He had spent years cultivating a fearsome reputation, a shield of public opinion, and she had seen through it with unnerving clarity. He took a step towards her, drawn by a force. He no longer had the will or desire to fight. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the labyrinth of his guilt that day? He began, his voice cracking. He stopped swallowing hard, forcing himself to tread the ground he had forbidden himself from revisiting. The argument. It was not our first. Isabella was... she was like a butterfly, and I held her with a fist, terrified she would fly away. Julian preyed on that. He made my devotion seem like a cage. That morning I found a note from him, not the one you hold, an earlier one, tucked in her riding gloves. It was foolish, flirtatious, but it was a betrayal. He began to pace the terrace, the agitated energy of the memory pouring out of him. I confronted her. I did not shout. I wish to God I had. I became cold. I presented the note as a barrister presents evidence. My voice, devoid of everything she should have heard. The hurt, the fear. I saw only the lie, not the frightened young woman in front of me. I demanded loyalty, as if it were a tax, a ducal right. She wept, called me unfeeling, and ran. She ran from the room, and I let her go. I stood there, in my cold, righteous anger, telling myself she would return, that she would see her folly. He stopped his back to her, gripping the cold stone of the balustrade. She never returned. And my last words to her, the final impression she had of the man she was to marry, was one of icy condemnation. The world whispered that my coldness drove her to recklessness, and I let them. I embraced the narrative because, in a way, it was true. My pride, my inability to show her the wounded heart behind the anger. It was a fatal flaw. I accepted the role of the monster because I felt like I had created one. He finally turned back to face her, and in the moonlight, she saw the glint of tears tracking through the dust of his composure. Julian knew all of it. He knew the precise nature of my guilt. He knew my pride would seal my lips forever. He watched me build my own prison, and then stood guard at the door, whispering the story of my monstrosity to anyone who would listen. He built his charm upon the wreckage of my life. The confession hung in the air raw and devastating. Eleonora felt her own tears fall, not of pity, but of profound empathy. She closed the distance between them, and without a thought for propriety, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles were corded with tension, but at her touch, a tremor ran through him, a subtle release. You have carried a burden that was never truly yours to bear. Alone, she said, her voice, a soothing balm on his raw wounds. You grieved not only for her, but for the words you never got to say. But that letter, she nodded towards the parchment in his hand. It proves she knew your heart, Alistair. She called your love a formidable thing, but she also called it true. She was coming back to you. Her last act was not one of flight, but of return. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to her face, his gaze searching hers with a desperate intensity. He saw no judgment, no revulsion. He saw only compassion, strength, and an understanding so complete it unmade him. The fortress of ice he had so meticulously constructed around his heart did not just crack, It melted away, flooding his soul with a warmth that was both terrifying and exquisite. "I swore an oath over her grave," he whispered, "that I would never love again. I saw it as a poison, a fatal weakness that led to nothing but betrayal and ashes." He lifted his free hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently, reverently cupping her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm, alive. "And then you came. You with your brilliant mind and your stubborn, beautiful heart. You did not lay siege to my fortress. You simply stood before the gates and spoke the truth, and the walls turned to dust." His thumb stroked her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Eleanora Vance." He said, his voice, now clear and steady, imbued with a purpose that had been absent for half a decade. "You have battled for my honor. You have given me back my past, not as a source of pain, but as a history I can finally mourn. You have given me a truth to build upon. My kingdom of ashes is gone. I stand before you with nothing but rubble at my feet and a future that is a terrifying blank canvas. Would you be willing to help me build a new world from the ruins?" It was the most unconventional, unromantic, and utterly perfect proposal she could have ever imagined. It was not a duke offering a title. It was a man offering his broken, healing soul. A world of steam engines and dusty books and spirited debate, she asked, a watery smile gracing her lips. A true smile, the first she had ever seen, transformed his face. It was like watching the sun break over a desolate landscape, and a duchess who reads Carnot in the original French. A partner in all things. Yes, she whispered the single word, carrying the weight of all her hopes, all her conviction. "Yes, Alistair, with all my heart." He closed his eyes, a shudder of profound relief running through his entire frame. When he opened them again, the last of the ghosts were gone. He was no longer the Duke of Ashes, but a man reborn in the moonlight, his face alight with a love that was indeed formidable, but one Eleonora knew was also loyal, steadfast, and now entirely hers. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the chaste, hesitant kiss of a courtship. It was a kiss of profound, soul-deep gratitude. It was a kiss of homecoming, of promises made and futures claimed. It was the sealing of a partnership forged in the most unlikely of fires. They did not return to the ballroom. Alistair wrapped his greatcoat around her shoulders, a silent shield against the chill and the prying eyes, and led her through a side entrance. The journey in his carriage back to her family's modest townhouse was spent in a comfortable, charged silence. They sat side by side, his hand holding hers with a possessive tenderness, their new reality slowly sinking in. This was not a dream. This was the beginning. His arrival at the Vance residence, well past midnight with their eldest daughter on his arm, nearly gave the Baron a heart attack. But when Alistair, the formidable Duke of Ashworth, stood in their small parlour, and with a humility that stunned her father into silence, formally requested Eleonora's hand in marriage, the shock turned to incredulous joy. Their new life began not in London, but at Ashworth. Eleonora had dreaded seeing the estate, imagining it as a Gothic mausoleum of sorrow. But as they crested the hill in Alistair's travelling carriage a month later, she saw not a place of tragedy, but a magnificent house of warm, honey-coloured stone, nestled in a valley and crying out for life. Alistair showed her everything. He was a different man here, more relaxed, the lines of tension around his eyes and mouth smoothed away. He showed her the stables, the gardens, and even one quiet afternoon, the place where Isabella had fallen. He stood there, not with a haunted look, but with a sombre peace. "This is where she died," he said simply, his hand holding Eleonora's. "It is a part of the history of this land, a sad part. But because of you, it is no longer the only part." Ashworth awakened under her touch. She did not throw out the past, but she let in the future. She had the heavy draperies taken down, allowing sunlight to flood the long, silent corridors. Laughter, a sound the old walls had not heard in years, became commonplace. The vast library became their sanctuary, a place where they would spend hours debating politics, philosophy, and the mundane business of the estate, their minds as perfectly matched as their hearts. The staff who had served the Duke of Ashes with fearful loyalty now adored the Duchess of Dawn, whose kindness and intelligence had brought their master and their home back to life. One evening, months after their wedding, Eleonora found Alistair in the gallery, standing before a portrait of a beautiful, vivacious young woman with a mischievous smile. Isabella. She came to stand beside him, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "She would have liked you," I think he said quietly. "She would have been intimidated by your intellect, but she would have admired your spirit." "And I would have liked her," Eleonora replied honestly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I'm sorry for the pain you both endured." "Do not be," he said, turning her to face him, his stormy eyes clear and filled with a deep, abiding love. "Every moment of it, every painful step through the darkness led me here. It led me to you." And in the quiet gallery of his ancestral home, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Alistair Blackwood, the man who had been saved by a voice in a ballroom, kissed his wife, his partner, his duchess. The ashes had long since grown cold, and in their place, something extraordinary and resilient and true had finally taken root. From the ashes of betrayal and the chilling whispers of a cruel society, a love story was forged in the fire of truth. Alistair and Eleonora's journey reminds us that the bravest act of love isn't found in grand gestures, but in the quiet courage to defend someone's honor, to seek the truth when lies are easier, and to believe in the goodness of a heart that the rest of the world has condemned. Theirs is a testament to the fact that even the deepest wounds can be healed by compassion, and the coldest heart can be thawed by the warmth of unwavering loyalty. What did you think of Eleonora's incredible courage at the Cavendish Ball? Let me know in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story of redemption and romance, please give this video a like and share it with a fellow story lover. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the past with us. Thank you for listening.